One of my biggest bugbears is when in movies we see infantry charging, running, sprinting as fast as they can into close combat with the opponent. In many battles this would be an absolutely crazy and stupid thing to do with your infantry. But as with all things, there are sometimes exceptions, which we're going to look at here. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now over the years, many people, when they've been asking me to do movie fight reviews or battle reviews in many cases, people have pointed out how many movies have this as a really annoying trope, where one side of supposedly trained and highly organised infantry just give up their formation and charge and sprint as fast as they can at enemy forces, thus losing any cohesion that they originally had. And you know what, I've got to agree, in most cases where we see these formations of infantry get together in a very coordinated way, sometimes we see them marching in column and then forming up in a shield wall or a testudo or whatever kind of, pike block, any kind of formation. And then when the battle starts, for some unknown reason, they lose their minds and run at the enemy as fast as they can. Usually the enemy's charging as well. They collide in the middle. Why on earth would most of those infantry formations do it? It's utterly stupid. So here are the main reasons why most coordinated infantry blocks wouldn't want to do that. Firstly, it means that you arrive at the enemy incomplete, incohesion. You're no longer in a formation. If you're using things like shields or pikes or weapons which rely on being used in fairly calm and collected, coordinated formations, you're not going to arrive in that formation. You're going to arrive in dribs and drabs because everybody moves at different speeds, especially if you're sprinting flat out. So you're going to lose all cohesion. You're going to arrive in dribs and drabs at the opposing force. So any kind of organisation or formation that you had to begin with is completely lost. And of course equipment like large shields like this Roman scutum, or indeed various types of polearm like this winged spear, or indeed pikes or halberds or anything else, not only are they reliant on being used pretty much in quite strict formations and ways that are going to be completely lost if you sprint at the enemy, but in addition to that, trying to sprint with these things is complete mayhem. I challenge you to pick up, let's put the spear down for a second, just pick up a large shield and run around with it. Okay, you can kind of do it. However, if you try and now do it in a group, you're going to be falling all over the place. If we bring the polearm back into it, if you're running around with these, they're going to trip people up. You're going to fall over your shield. Potentially, if you're running, your shield's not going to be in front of you and not going to be protecting you properly. It's complete nonsense. For soldiers equipped with weapons like these, you shouldn't be sprinting at the enemy. And moreover, even if you try and do it, perhaps you can do it as an individual, but as I mentioned, if you do it in a large group, you're going to be tripping over your friends next to you. Half of you are going to end up lying on the ground. And remember, we're not running along a gym hall here. You're running, presumably, in a field, perhaps up a slope or down a slope. There's going to be potholes and divots and molehills and all sorts of other things, perhaps other people's equipment that you're going to be tripping over. It is just a terrible, terrible way to approach the enemy. And you know, something that often gets overlooked, particularly in video games, and I have to say also in wargaming and even in role-playing games as well, but any of us who do reenactment or HEMA, any types of even LARP, any kind of actual physical activity with these sorts of equipment, can tell you from the bottom of our heart, stamina, your breath, your ability to keep moving, keep carrying that thing, keep fighting is a really, really major factor in who wins, who loses, or how well you perform. And quite simply, there is no good reason for most infantry forces, we're going to look at some exceptions in a minute, there is no good reason for forces carrying heavy equipment, wearing potentially heavy armour or elements of armour, helmets, crests, shields, large polearms, to be running, because by the time you arrive at the enemy lines, you're going to be gassed, you're going to be out of breath, and your fighting capacity is now going to be lower than the opponents who've just been, if they're sensible, standing there and waiting for you. And you know what? There's another big disadvantage to launching a charge, and there are reasons to do it. As I say, we'll get to those in a second. But once you've launched a charge, it's kind of like shooting a cannon. It's done, it's gone. You can't, with a large group of men, perhaps with smaller skirmishing, but with a large group of soldiers, you can't generally really change what's happening once you've launched that charge. It's a bit like a kind of herd animal, like a horse. When you get them stampeding, they're off, they're gone. So as we see in certain battles, in fact, throughout history, once one side does launch a charge, whether it's with cavalry or infantry, it's kind of done. It's a done deal. That's it. There's no turning back now. You can't maneuver. You can't react very much to what the opponents are doing. If it's a trap, Admiral Akbar quote coming in there. But when you can't really change or divert from what you're doing. So it is, generally speaking, disadvantageous. But that being said, there are, in fact, some good reasons to charge for certain types of infantry. Let's look at those. But before we do, I just want to reiterate that for most types of heavy infantry using very large shields or wearing very cumbersome armour or using particularly large pole arms, spears, pikes, halberds, bills, things like this, generally speaking, charging is usually a really bad idea, and you have to have very specific reasons for deciding to do it. So before I go into the reasons why sometimes infantry should charge and historically did charge, it's really important to make it clear that whilst most of the time in movies they inappropriately have armies sprinting towards the enemy for no good reason, there are in fact some very good reasons historically, and in fact even in the modern world, why you might want to run towards an opponent. But those criteria have to be filled for it to make sense in terms of the narrative, or indeed in terms of the tactics if you were talking about real warfare. So we need some of those criteria to be in place to justify sprinting at the enemy. Now obviously the ultimate manifestation of charging towards the enemy is cavalry. It's what cavalry does. They ride horses so they can move more quickly. Yes, sometimes the horses have an actual physical effect on the opponent. Sometimes they can smash through a line. Sometimes they can kick and bite and things like this. But largely, cavalry or indeed chariots, it's largely about moving quickly across the battlefield. So why would you need to do that? Well, one role we can instantly dispel is the idea of scouting. Okay, now absolutely infantry can scout, but a human can't, generally speaking, move faster than another human. So cavalry is particularly good at scouting because it can go, it can see the opponents, and it can ride off at high speed. Generally speaking, infantry can't do that very well, at least if the opponents have cavalry, because the cavalry can just charge after your infantry scouts. So in some cases when there's only infantry, so in certain parts of Africa or the Americas before the horses came along, absolutely there are some cultures where fast moving light infantry would have fulfilled the role of scouting cavalry. But if there are any horses around, you can't easily scout with infantry because you can't get away from their horses. So in history there were two groups of people who are especially famous, and they're certainly not the only ones, but they're especially famous in the study of military history for sprinting, running as fast as they could at enemy infantry on foot. One of those are the Highlanders with the famous Highland Charge, and the other are the Zulus. And now in both of these cases they were dealing with the same factor, and that is gunpowder. Moreover, they were dealing with superior gunpowder, that is, superior numbers of firearms. So quite simply, the Highlanders were always pitted against government forces which vastly outnumbered them in terms of firepower, both in terms of the muskets, a number of muskets being used, but also in terms of artillery as well. And it was pretty much the same for the Zulus also. They were facing the British with breech loading rifles, the Martini Henry at that time, and they were armed for the most part. They did have some rifles, but for the most part they were armed with spears. So in both cases they couldn't stand there and duke it out because they were in essentially a shooting war. And if you're against a vastly superior shooting enemy, the best thing you can do is bring it to hand combat. Now, they certainly weren't the only ones to do that. For example, the Sudanese, the dervishes in the 1880s all the way through to 1900 were doing the same thing against British and other forces. We sometimes see similar things in North Africa against the French, for example, against the French Foreign Legion and French regular forces. We see similar examples, you could probably say, in the conquest of the Americas as well, when the Spanish and Portuguese turned up, and later on the Dutch and the English and everyone else. In many of those cases, the Native Americans tried to come to hand-to-hand combat as quickly as possible. And to some extent, we see this even in the middle of the 19th century with the India Mutiny and the Sikh Wars as well. In some cases where the Indian armies vastly outnumbered the British and loyalist, should we say, armies pitted against them. But of course, the British had superior firepower, usually, although not always. And so in some cases, the Sikhs, or the sepoys in the case of the mutiny, tried to bring it to hand-to-hand combat as quickly as possible, just the same as the dervishes did in the Sudan. So in that particular scenario, where your opponent is standing shooting at you and you can't match them shot for shot, the best thing you can do, if running away is not an option or hiding behind fortifications, as the Maoris did, to be fair, they built really good gunpowder fortifications. If that's not an option, your best option is to get to the enemy as quickly as possible. And in that case, running at them or charging at them, and obviously if you've got horses, you would charge on horseback, but if you're on foot, then charging on foot, it's a question of reducing the number of volleys or the number of rounds that get shot your way, and then bringing it to hand-to-hand combat as quickly as possible. So in my mind, this is really the main reason for running at an enemy, if they are standing and shooting. Some people might say, Matt, what about if they're in a defensive position and they're just not attacking you? If they're just standing there, let's say our numbers are equal, let's say it's France versus England, and the English have, like they did at Crécy, occupied a raised ground position. They've got lots of archers and they're standing there shooting. What do you do? Well, in that particular case, strangely, it's a slightly similar situation to the Zulu or a Highland charge situation. In that case, the English had lots of arrows and they could just stand there and shoot, and the French, didn't have as many archers probably, and so they decided to rush into the English. It didn't go well, as we know. However, potentially it could have done, and at Agincourt they had a plan for trying to overcome English archers by charging them with cavalry. It didn't work because of the lay of the land, probably that's the reason, and perhaps even the muddiness of the ground. But later on in the 100 Years' War between England and France, there were situations where it worked, where they managed to rush the archers quickly enough, and in some cases before they had deployed, particularly with cavalry, but it could be done with infantry as well, so that they would mitigate the firepower, I know they're longbows, but the firepower of the English by just rushing them really, really quickly. And this is something we also see during campaigns as well, whether it's a fortification. Fortifications, believe it or not, don't work very well if the gates haven't been locked. And for example, in the Welsh Wars, Edward I lost a couple of castles on a couple of occasions because the Welsh just attacked really quickly. They attacked so quickly that they couldn't shut the castle up and they got in. I think it happened at Raglan, if I remember correctly. But it also happened during the 100 Years' War, during the Crécy campaign, where the English came across French towns and people were going around their normal business. Maybe they hadn't got the memo that the English were coming, and the English quickly stormed the town before they could raise the drawbridge, close the gates, drop the portcullis, or whatever they needed to do. So that is another situation where sometimes running is useful, where you're trying to overwhelm an enemy as quickly as possible so that they can't deploy, either close their gates or deploy their artillery or get their archers in position. And a final point is that some people might question, what about if the numbers are different? If there are a lot more attackers, maybe you want to charge the enemy? I would say no, because if you've got the ability to shoot at them, you're better off with your superior numbers just shooting them to pieces. Your superior numbers and charging only really makes sense if you don't have the ability to shoot back at the less numerical opponent. So if, for example, I have a massive army of 10,000 dervishes and there are 2,000 British there, Well, the 2000 British have breech-loading rifles and, in some cases, machine guns and artillery. If I've got 10,000 dervishes, but I've only got 200 rifles, well, in that case, the best thing I can do is try and overwhelm them and swamp them. But if I had 10,000 rifles, the best thing I could do is shoot them to pieces. So it depends very much on the disparity of equipment that we've got between us. And just to finish off, I'm going to say something else. There is a correlating factor, whether it's Highlanders or whether it's Zulus or any of the other people I've talked about. If you want to charge and run at enemy infantry, then for the most part, you want to be not heavily encumbered and heavily equipped. So you'll notice Highlanders don't carry an awful lot of stuff. They usually have one musket or a couple of pistols, which gets ditched usually after it's been shot. They've basically got a sword and a small shield, a targe. Charging with a large Roman scutum or a pavis, not very easy. Charging with a pike, not very easy. But with something smallish, like a Zulu spear and a light hide shield, or with a basket hilt and a small targe, that works. So your ability to run at the enemy is also dependent partly on what you're wearing. If you're in full plate harness or carrying a pike, not so easy. So to conclude, running, sprinting at enemy infantry with your infantry isn't always wrong, but there have to be specific criteria in place. It needs to make sense for it to happen. When we look at a movie like Braveheart, where you've got one lot of armoured infantry against another lot of armoured infantry, and they sprint at each other and collide in the middle, what's that achieving? The side that just stood there in a coordinated fashion and got their shields in order and everything else would have a huge advantage. And this is most often in the media portrayed with Romans versus barbarians. And very often we see the coordinated Romans marching forward with their shields locked and the barbarians hurling themselves onto the shields to die magnificently and always get defeated. That is a very stark example. And actually, although it's a trope, I think it's closest to the truth. If we look at a movie like Troy, where you've got two forces, both with large shields, both with spears, why would they run at each other? You wouldn't be running around with a large shield and a spear. Those are not the right equipment to be sprinting around. And why would you sprint? It makes no sense. So, to redeem myself and my rant, in most cases in movies where infantry are sprinting at other infantry, it is idiotic and it makes no sense. But there are some situations where it makes perfect sense. So it's all about the story. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be. I really hope you're subscribed. It makes a huge difference to who gets to enjoy these videos. So make sure you click that subscribe button and I'll see you back on the channel really soon for another video. Cheers folks.